5, 1997, and Rosemary Pascente, a 64-year-old school teacher, was enjoying her day off, having a cozy evening in her 23rd floor apartment in the Bronx in New York City, USA. Sadly, she had no idea what awaited for her next. The next day, on January 6, 1997, one of Rosemary's neighbors noticed that the lights in Rosemary's apartment had been on since the previous night. In the evening, she decided to go and check on Rosemary. What she discovered when she walked into the apartment was something that would haunt her for her life. The cold, lifeless body of Rosemary Pascente laid in the kitchen of her apartment. Looking at the bloody scene, the neighbor collapsed to the floor, sobbing before contacting the authorities. Who could have done something so horrible to a simple elderly school teacher? What could have been the motive behind this ruthless murder? Today's case takes us to the Bronx, a borough of New York City. It is tremendously famous for inhabiting the largest cooperative-owned space in America, known as Co-op City. In addition to that, the Bronx is also home to the iconic Yankee Stadium, the Bronx Zoo, and the gorgeous New York City Botanical Gardens. For those who want to spend less on rent but still live close to other high-end boroughs such as Manhattan, the Bronx is the right place. But this beautiful neighborhood also has a dark side. The Bronx is only safer than 14% of U.S. neighborhoods. The chance of someone falling victim to a violent crime in the Bronx is 1 in 128, making it a significantly dangerous place. And this fact takes us back to 1997, when a 64-year-old lady was gruesomely murdered in her own apartment. Rosemary Pascente was born on July 28, 1932. Although not much is known about Rosemary's early life, it is definite that she never married anyone. For most of her life, Rosemary was the kind of woman who minded her own business and mostly kept to herself. In 1972, she moved to 140 Alcott Place, an apartment in Co-op City in the Bronx. For the next 25 years, she lived there alone, all by herself, and worked as a school teacher. Although she led quite a monotonous life, she would often step out to spend time with a few of her neighbors she had befriended in the building. Sunday, January 5, 1997, was quite a cold day in the Bronx, and Rosemary decided to stay in. The night passed, and on Monday morning, January 6, 1997, Rosemary never showed up to school where she worked. Her phone rang multiple times, disrupting the pin-drop silence in her apartment, but there was no answer. One of Rosemary's neighbors noticed something odd. The lights in Rosemary's apartment had stayed on through the night. However, she didn't put much thought into it. But when she tried calling Rosemary and got no answer throughout the day, she grew concerned. And then in the evening at 6:15 p.m., the neighbor decided to check up on Rosemary and went to her apartment. From the moment she arrived at Rosemary's apartment door, she had an eerie feeling. The door to the apartment had been left slightly open. She walked in slowly, taking small steps, afraid of what she might find. The neighbor's worst fears came true as soon as she walked into the kitchen and discovered Rosemary's body in a pool of blood. She shrieked looking at the gruesome scene and tried to pull herself together. She informed the authorities immediately, and soon Detective George Wood and Sergeant Curtis Oates from the New York Police Department arrived to inspect the crime scene.
She walked inside the apartment and she called for a friend, but there was no answer. After looking around the apartment, and she noticed in the kitchen area that she noticed Miss Pascente, victim of a crime.
Rosemary's body was almost completely covered in blood. She was lying face down with a 9-inch knife still lodged in her back. Looking at the multiple stab wounds on Rosemary's body, the detectives could tell that she had suffered an extremely painful death.
I noticed maybe 20, 25 stab wounds in the back, in the neck area, 1 or 2 in the head, and it looked like she had been involved in a struggle with someone. I also noted some defensive wounds to her right hand, so she struggled with the perpetrator.
Detectives also noticed that Rosemary's throat had been slit, and the defensive bruises suggested that Rosemary had put up a fight against her attacker during the struggle between the two. Outside the apartment in the lobby, there was more evidence that supported their theory. Detectives found stains of blood smeared across the wall next to the elevator. However, there was no traces of blood inside the elevator. This led the detectives to search the staircase of the building, and on the 10th floor across a flight of stairs, there was another trail of blood. Detectives now believed that sometime during the struggle, Rosemary had managed to wound her attacker. Detectives were sure that the blood found smeared across the elevator wall and on the staircase 13 floors below Rosemary's apartment belonged to the person who killed Rosemary. This gave detectives an idea about how Rosemary's killer might have escaped the building. At first, they thought of taking the elevator and pressed the button with his blood-covered hands and left a trail on the wall. But perhaps the elevator was taking too long, or maybe they thought that given their messy appearance, someone in the elevator might suspect them. They then thought it would be best to take the stairs if they wanted to leave the building without being noticed, and that was what they did. While the bloodstains were a strong piece of evidence in the case, it didn't give detectives an idea of who the killer might be. The samples were obtained and preserved for further testing and future use. Later, an autopsy confirmed that Rosemary had been stabbed a total of 39 times, out of which 8 wounds were on her back. The knife found jammed into Rosemary's back belonged to a set from her own kitchen. This made the detectives believe that Rosemary's murder was probably not a premeditated one. They came up with the theory that when the attacker entered Rosemary's apartment, they initially didn't have any intentions of killing her. But when a struggle ensued, they did it anyway. And since there were some items missing from the apartment, it seemed like robbery was the motive behind the tragic incident. A few days after the murder, a funeral was held for Rosemary at Granby Cemetery, Granby, Hartford County, Connecticut, USA. Her loved ones gathered around to pay their respects, and she was laid to rest. Weeks and months went by, but there weren't any new developments in the case. Even with strong evidence and convincing theories, detectives were having a hard time coming up with any leads to follow. Soon the police department diverted their attention to a fresh trail of murders in New York, and Rosemary's case went cold. More than 2 years later, in May 1999, Detective Kevin Lawler from the NYPD was assigned to the cold case squad and handed Rosemary's case. Skimming through Rosemary's case file, he had an idea of how he was going to move forward with the case.
I requested that the blood recovered from the crime scene entered into the CODES system to be compared to any blood samples or any known subjects that were arrested that had supplied their DNA samples.
With assistance from Detective Mark Tebbins, Detective Lawler got the blood samples found on the elevator wall and in the staircase re-examined. The forensics department was successful in developing a DNA profile of Rosemary's killer, and it was uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System, or simply CODES, which is a nationwide database of DNA profiles. All the detectives needed to do now was wait and hope for a match. After another 2 years, on August 20, 2001, Detective Lawler received a phone call from the NYPD Crime Lab regarding Rosemary's case.
I was informed that a match was made with the blood recovered from the crime scene with a subject by the name of Charles Jones.
There finally was a match through CODES, and the person was identified at 28-year-old Charles Jones. Detective Lawler had been desperately awaiting this call, and now that he had the information he needed, he wasted no time in investigating the genetic link further. In order to make sure that he wasn't missing anything out, he performed a background check on Jones and uncovered some intriguing information.
I did a background check on him. I found out his priors, which were lengthy. I also found out that he had just been released from prison on a past robbery where he assaulted his victim with a knife.
Originally, Jones wasn't linked to Rosemary's murder, but since he had been imprisoned after pleading guilty to a robbery and assault of another Co-op City resident on August 13, 1998, he was required to submit a DNA sample right before being released on August 10, 2001. And then on August 20, 2001, when Jones's DNA profile was uploaded on CODES, it matched with the sample that belonged to Rosemary's killer. Furthermore, at the time of Rosemary's murder, Jones himself lived in Co-op City, just a couple blocks from her apartment. While this strengthened the elevator against Jones, it still wasn't enough for Detective Lawler to charge Jones yet. Detective Lawler was quick to realize that while the blood sample evidence did place Charles Jones in the building at the time of the murder, it did not place him in any way inside Rosemary's apartment, where the murder took place. This could completely destroy the detective's theory of Rosemary's murder and give Jones a chance to escape. Detective Lawler and Detective Tebbins needed more information and stronger evidence to put Jones behind bars.
My theory was that the person involved with this homicide came into the building with the intent to rob somebody, looking for an opportunity to push into someone's apartment.
There was quite a bit of distance between that blood and the crime scene. So you have to establish how his blood got to that fifth floor hallway.
They decided to head over to Jones's house and have a talk with him.
We tried to track this individual down to his parole officer. We found out that he had a warrant on him And so our game plan at that point was to try to pick him up and talk to him.
We went to his apartment. I was informed that he wasn't home, that they didn't know where he was. The family was covering for him, just the mere fact that I was a police officer.
When the detectives arrived at Jones's place, they were told that he wasn't home at the time and that they should come back later. Since they didn't have solid evidence against Jones yet, they had to be extremely careful about the case, as even a slight misstep could cause all their progress to be lost. They didn't want anyone in Jones's family to learn about the reason behind their visit, which could tip him off and give him another chance to escape. And so they left a message for Jones saying that he had an outstanding traffic violation and they only wanted to talk to him to clear it. The detectives had to leave Jones's house without seeing him, but not without setting up a trap for him. A couple of days later, Jones took the bait and showed up to the precinct to talk about his traffic violation. The next steps were going to be very crucial, as Jones would soon be made aware of the real reason while he was called in for questioning. Detectives wanted to create a comfy environment for Jones before confronting him.
We had him think that he was being arrested for an outstanding warrant for a traffic violation. We brought him into the precinct. And at first, we sat him down in our office. We gave him lunch. We brought him a soda. We had him relaxed. We became buddy-buddies with him, so to speak.
After 30 minutes of being nice to Jones, the detectives began the interrogation.
And when I asked him if he had ever been in 140 Alcott Place, he told me that he was never in the building, that he had no need to be in that building. So with that, now I know he's lying to me.
Even though Jones seemed nervous, he still wasn't breaking, and so detectives threw in some facts to shake his confidence. They told him that the blood found in the building of Rosemary's apartment belonged to him, and that was enough evidence to link him to Rosemary's murder.
He looks at me and he says, well, I used to deliver groceries. And one time when I was delivering groceries, I had cut my hand on one of the shopping carts. And maybe that time was when my blood was left in the building. Then I went on to tell him that, well, why is it that your blood was found in the building the same time this woman is murdered in the building? I said, can you explain that to me? And he sat back and looked at me, put his head down, and stayed silent for a good period of time.
Listening to this information, Jones changed his story. The process still didn't seem like it was working. Detective Lawler had to do something more to break Jones and get a clear confession out of him. He walked up to his desk, picked up an envelope, and pulled out a bunch of pictures and laid them on the table in front of Jones. The pictures showed Rosemary's body lying cold and lifeless on her kitchen floor. Detective Lawler thought this might drive Jones into admitting his guilt, but he was wrong.
And he still wouldn't look at the pictures right away. He just kept his head down. He was looking at the floor. And then finally looked up and started looking at the photos that I was showing him of the victim, which weren't nice. Then I went on to say, well, you know what? I'm going to charge you with this homicide. He's giving me no response.
The tensions were now high, even after several attempts of making him speak the truth, but the detectives were not letting him go anywhere. The interrogation went on for another 8 hours and only came to an end when Jones finally gave in. He decided to confess to the murder and cut a deal for his plea bargain. By stating a straight 8,
He sits back, starts looking through the photos again, and he says, well, you have to guarantee me I can get a straight 8.
Jones meant that he would serve only 8 years in prison for a full confession of the murder.
I told him, I can't guarantee you're going to get a straight 8. I said, again, I'll tell you, I'll speak to the DA. I said, you know, whatever you and your lawyer work out with the district attorney's office is out of my hands. With that, Mr. Jones decided to tell me the whole story.
By now, Jones had realized that there was no way out of this mess. One way or another, he would have to give in and suffer the damage for his actions. But thankfully, Jones chose wisely. Instead of contesting the accusations against him, he gave Detectives Lawler a full confession, hoping that it would help him during his sentencing.
Open the door. I'm on this side. She seen me. She panicked. I'm trying to tell her I'm delivering her groceries. She grabbed a knife and I stabbed in the back, trying to protect myself.
According to Jones, the whole incident was merely a misunderstanding. He was persistent that Rosemary attacked him first, and he only acted in self-defense.
Basically, he's, how can I put it, hunting at random. This was a victim of chance. When Mrs. Pascente confronted Mr. Jones, it appears that she went to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a knife to defend herself from this unknown person who had just entered her apartment. A struggle ensued where Mr. Jones took the knife from Mrs. Pascente and repeatedly stabbed her about her body, also cutting her throat. After that, Mr. Jones said he just left the apartment, taking a few items. That was it.
However, something about this confession wasn't sitting well with the detectives. At the time of the murder, Jones was 23 years old, almost 6 feet tall. A well-built tall man defending himself from a 5'4" elderly woman seemed like a made-up story. While it did seem like this wasn't premeditated murder, the detectives weren't fully on board with the idea that Jones acted in self-defense. Charles Jones was arrested on Friday, August 24, 2001, and charged with robbery in the murder of Rosemary Pascente. Jones was made aware that if he contested the accusations against him in the court and lost, it would end in a lengthy murder trial with a possible death penalty as the outcome. On the morning of January 11, 2002, in the Bronx County Courthouse, Jones pleaded guilty to a charge of first-degree manslaughter and was handed a sentence of 19 years behind bars. Charles Jones's capture brought closure to many of the Bronx residents, but especially to Rosemary's loving neighbors. Even though their friend was long gone, she would never be forgotten. Rosemary's case being solved brought a huge amount of relief to her family and friends. Belinda Bailey, one of Rosemary's neighbors and friends, said that her friend's murder remained a mystery for almost 4 years, and those 4 years were the most painful for her. She lived right down the hall from Rosemary's apartment, and whenever she crossed it, she would think of her. Even though it took some time, the detectives were able to solve Rosemary's case through DNA technology and bring closure to her loved ones. Detectives are now determined to implement the same technology to crack thousands of other cold cases and serve justice to victims like Rosemary and their families. Jones's confession told a different story from what the detectives had theorized. Do you think he was hiding the whole truth or not? Apart from Rosemary, Jones was linked to another assault from 1998. Do you think there are more cases in which Jones escaped from undetected?
Pray for the soul of the evil man responsible for this, because he's going to need it.
On the morning of August 15, 1975, at precisely 11:23 a.m., a phone call was made to the Marple Police Department. The caller was David Zanstra, a minister who had also happened to be in charge of a summer Bible camp. His report was chilling. An 8-year-old girl named Gretchen Harrington had disappeared. Gretchen had set out from her home in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, with the intention of walking to the camp, which was less than a half a mile away. But she never arrived. A frantic search for Gretchen was immediately initiated, but it yielded no results. 2 months later, on October 14, 1975, Gretchen's skeletal remains were found in the nearby Ridley Creek State Park. Despite this shocking revelation, the crime remained unsolved, leaving the community bewildered and anxious. So, what happened to Gretchen after she set out for the summer Bible camp? Would the truth about Gretchen's disappearance and death come to light? Today's case takes us to Marple Township, which is located in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, United States. As of 2015, it had a population of more than 23,000 people. Marple Township is home to a number of interesting attractions, including the Broomall Fields and Marple Gardens. Marple Township is a relatively safe place to live. With a crime rate that is lower than the national average, its crime score of 0.17 makes it one of Pennsylvania's safest towns. It was here that Gretchen Harrington's story began. On June 13, 1967, Gretchen Eleanor Harrington was born to Harold Boyd Harrington and Ina Harrington. At the time, her father Harold worked as a minister at a Presbyterian church.
I grew up here, and she lived down at the bottom of the hill, the church. Her father was a pastor down there.
For Jacqueline Morgan, she has haunting memories of a case that gripped Broomall, Delaware County for 48 years. Others also immediately thought back to August of 1975 and the disappearance of 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington. Hundreds would search for her shortly after she vanished from her Lawrence Road home.
Do you remember that being a scary time where people were just kind of...
Yes, people were definitely afraid to let their kids out.
In addition to her parents, Gretchen had two older sisters named Zoe and Harriet. Gretchen's family described her as a person who radiated kindness and had a sweet and gentle nature. By 1975, at the age of 8, Gretchen was attending second grade at Delaware County Christian School in Newtown Square. Everything appeared to be going well for Gretchen and her family until a tragic event disrupted their lives. On the morning of August 15, 1975, Gretchen left home to attend a summer Bible camp program. This camp had two locations. The first was Trinity Church Chapel Christian Reformed Church, where a man named David Zanstra served as a pastor. The second location was the Reformed Presbyterian Church, where Gretchen's father, Harold, was the pastor. The Bible camp activities took place in the morning at the first church, and afterwards, David would transport the children to the second church. The Harrington and Zanstra families were well acquainted with each other. They lived nearby, and both fathers worked as pastors, while both mothers played the traditional role of a pastor's wife. In fact, one of Zanstra's daughters was Gretchen's best friend. Gretchen's journey that day was unusual. Typically, she would be walking to the summer Bible camp program with her two sisters, 12-year-old Zoe and 11-year-old Harriet. It was their daily routine. However, on that particular day, their mother Ina had just given birth to a baby named Jessica and was bringing the newborn home. Zoe and Harriet chose to stay back and await their return. Despite this change in routine, Harold, Gretchen's father, encouraged her to go to the summer Bible camp program to maintain her perfect attendance record, and so Gretchen embarked on the walk alone as her father bid her farewell. It was just past 9 a.m. when she began her stroll up the hill towards Trinity. Harold kept a watchful eye on her as she proceeded along Lawrence Road. Little did he know that once she was out of his sight, it would mark the last time he would ever see his daughter alive. In the 1970s, in a peaceful suburban place like Marple, it was entirely normal to see children walking alone on sunny summer days. The idea of danger didn't even cross people's minds. This was a time when kids freely played until late in the evening. They roamed the streets, ventured into the woods, and even cooled off at Darby Creek, which flowed behind Gretchen's house without any worries. Children would walk to their friends' houses blocks away without any aid of cell phones or GPS watches to keep them connected to their parents. Marple was simply an exceptionally safe place. That's precisely why many longtime Philadelphians chose to move there in the 1960s. Gretchen was supposed to be at Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church by 9:30 a.m., but she didn't arrive as scheduled. The first inkling that something was amiss came when Harold noticed her absence around 11 a.m. A group of Gretchen's friends had come to the front door of their residence looking for her. Worried and unable to locate Gretchen within the classes or nearby, Harold took immediate action. He phoned the Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church and spoke with Maggie Zanstra, David's wife, in an attempt to determine his daughter's whereabouts. However, he was told she hadn't been seen. Following this, the Marple Township Police Department was contacted by David, and Gretchen was formally reported as missing. Gretchen's disappearance sent shockwaves through Broomall and Marple Township. By the following day, August 16, 1975, an extensive search effort involving hundreds of people was underway to find her. This included volunteer firefighters and canine units, who scoured both sides of the creek, fields, and wooded areas. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter continuously scanned the area from above. However, on August 17, 1975, just 2 days after Gretchen went missing, the police had to call off the large-scale search operation because they had very little information to work with. The police chief, Daniel Hennessy, candidly admitted to a local newspaper that they had no clues regarding her whereabouts. This situation threw the entire town into a state of panic, shaking the community's sense of security to its core.
Remember that being a scary time where people were just kind of...
Yes, people were definitely afraid to let their kids out.
In response, friends and family members started distributing flyers to passing motorists in the area. These flyers featured Gretchen's most recent school photo, showcasing her with a missing tooth and a cheerful childlike grin. The absence of information led to a surge in speculation and countless unanswered questions. Did she run away? Did she accidentally drown in the creek? Could a stranger have abducted her, or was it someone she knew? The mystery surrounding Gretchen's disappearance left everyone deeply concerned and bewildered. In the days that followed after Gretchen vanished, the police worked to gather information and understand the events surrounding her disappearance. One of their key interviews took place on August 19th, when they spoke with David. During this conversation, David disclosed that he had indeed transported a group of children to the church on the day Gretchen disappeared. However, he stated that he had not seen her on that particular day. As August turned into September, Gretchen's sisters, Zoe and Harriet Harrington, resumed attending Delaware County Christian School. However, their fellow students found it difficult to approach them or engage in conversation, unsure of what to say in the face of such a heart-wrenching situation. When traditional investigative methods yielded no results, the police decided to pursue an unconventional avenue in their search for Gretchen. They turned to the assistance of a psychic named Judith Richardson Hames. Judith was known for using her psychic abilities to aid law enforcement in solving nearly 100 criminal cases, particularly those involving missing children. In September 1975, Judith sat down with police officers, and she made a prediction that she herself hoped would prove to be incorrect. According to her psychic insights, she believed that Gretchen was dead. A month later, on October 14, 1975, a jogger exploring Ridley Creek State Park stumbled upon a decaying body hidden in the forest. Initially unsure of what he had come across, his uncertainty vanished when he noticed a human fingernail. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, the jogger promptly contacted the police. Gretchen's parents examined the distinctive clothing discovered with the remains, and they confirmed it was hers. Subsequently, the medical examiner matched the body to Gretchen using dental records. The tragic conclusion was that Gretchen's death had resulted from homicide. The forensic examination revealed that her skull had sustained multiple fractures, indicating a severe beating. Although the police initially suspected abuse, the autopsy did not yield any concrete evidence to support this hypothesis. On Sunday, October 19, 1975, just a few days after Gretchen's body was discovered, her father Harold stood at the pulpit and delivered a deeply emotional sermon. In his heart-wrenching address, he spoke of Gretchen's faith in Christ. He pointed out that she was now free from this world, but her murderer remained bound by their terrible actions. Gretchen's funeral was a somber event, and David officiated the service for the 8-year-old. Following the ceremony, she was laid to rest in Meridian Line Cemetery, situated in Johannesburg, Michigan, USA. Meanwhile, the discovery of Gretchen's body in the woods ignited renewed fervor for the investigation. Witnesses began to step forward, sharing accounts of various individuals they had seen in the vicinity where Gretchen's body was found. These eyewitness reports provided descriptions of men who had been in the area. As a result, the police received a flood of tips from the community, with some seeming more promising than others, while others turned out to be unrelated or unhelpful in the pursuit of justice. Investigators examined a range of potential suspects, even scrutinizing individuals with prior criminal records residing in the vicinity. Despite their efforts, no significant leads emerged, and the evidence box stored at Marple Township Police Department headquarters began to gather dust. This box contained a trove of materials, including reel-to-reel tape interviews, photographs, and memoranda, all relevant to the case, but the lack of progress had it sitting idle. As time passed, the investigation into Gretchen's disappearance grew cold. Occasionally during roll call meetings or when a detective had a spare moment in an otherwise uneventful week, they would revisit the case. They would look through the file, hoping to spot something they had missed before, but each time, it seemed like a futile effort. The leads always led to dead ends, leaving them frustrated and without any breakthroughs in the case. For many decades, there were no developments in the case. The original detectives who had been working on Gretchen's disappearance had either passed away or retired. However, in the fall of 2022, there was a significant turn of events. A woman whose name was not released to the public reached out to the Marple Police Department, expressing her desire to discuss Gretchen's disappearance and murder. At the time, Nick Coffin, a sergeant, had taken charge of Gretchen's cold case. Therefore, when this woman contacted the Marple police, her message was directed to Coffin's phone. The woman informed Coffin that she believed she had information about who might have been responsible for Gretchen's tragic fate. She also mentioned an attempted kidnapping incident that had occurred around the same time, raising suspicions of a possible connection. This unexpected contact rekindled hope for solving the long-standing mystery surrounding Gretchen's disappearance and murder. On January 2, 2023, state troopers arranged an interview with the woman identified only by her initials, SF, denoting her as a confidential informant. This interview would prove to be a momentous breakthrough in a cold case that had remained unresolved for nearly 5 decades. According to SF, she had been a schoolmate of Gretchen and one of her sisters, Zoe. SF also disclosed to investigators that she had been friends with David Zanstra's daughters and frequently visited the Zanstra residence, even staying overnight on occasions. During one of these sleepovers, when she was 10 years old, SF recounted awakening in the middle of the night to find David inappropriately touching her. Frightened by this disturbing behavior, she shifted her position and prompted David to hastily exit the room. Shockingly, this inappropriate touching occurred again the following night. In the morning, when the girls awoke, SF decided to confide in David's daughter about her father's unsettling actions. To her astonishment, the daughter responded with something along the lines of, "He does that sometimes." Over time, SF mustered the courage to share this distressing experience with her parents. Shortly after Gretchen's disappearance, the Zanstra family relocated to Plano, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, in response to the situation. During her interview, SF also shared with state police information about another child in their neighborhood, a girl named Holly, whom she considered a friend. According to her, someone had made an attempt to abduct Holly. As the conversation unfolded, SF presented the investigators with a diary she had kept during her childhood. In a specific diary entry dated September 15, 1975, she had written that a man had tried to kidnap Holly twice. In the diary, she went on to express her suspicion that this man, whom she referred to as Mr. Z, might be the one responsible for Gretchen's kidnapping. Mr. Z was her way of referring to David. This revelation from SF added a significant layer to the investigation into Gretchen's disappearance and murder. The interview with SF and her diary entry motivated investigators to locate 83-year-old David, who was now residing in Marietta, situated northwest of Atlanta, Georgia. On July 17, 2023, investigators conducted an interview with David at the Cobb County Police Headquarters in Marietta. This interview was carried out by 2 Pennsylvania troopers, Andrew Martin and Eugene Trey. The conversation started with a somewhat friendly tone. In the beginning, David initially denied having encountered Gretchen on the day she disappeared. However, this situation took a different turn when the police informed David about the allegations of assault made by a woman who had documented her experiences in the diary. As the conversation progressed, David eventually broke down and confessed to something profoundly disturbing. David recounted to the police that he had observed Gretchen walking towards the church that morning. He claimed that he offered her a ride in his green AMC Rambler station wagon, and she accepted as she had no reason to decline the offer. However, contrary to taking her to church as promised, David admitted to investigators that he drove Gretchen to a nearby wooded area. There he parked the car and instructed Gretchen to undress, but she refused. Following this, he struck Gretchen with his fist, resulting in her suffering head injuries and bleeding. David then admitted that, hearing Gretchen was dead, he tried to conceal her partially unclothed body with sticks before leaving the area. This shocking revelation left detectives stunned as they processed the horrifying details of what David had confessed to. In the wake of this shocking revelation, David was arrested and faced a slew of serious charges, including criminal homicide and first-degree murder, as a result of his confession regarding Gretchen.
But the big story on Action News tonight is the arrest announced today in the decades-old murder of an 8-year-old girl in Delaware County.
David Vanstra is, ladies and gentlemen, a monster. He is every parent's worst nightmare.
And tonight, David Zanstra, now 83 years old, is finally behind bars. Prosecutors say he abducted and brutally killed Gretchen Harrington back in 1975 as that little girl walked to the Bible camp where he was a pastor.
While David's confession provided some closure concerning Gretchen's fate, it also raised a disconcerting question with ramifications that reached far and wide. Could this man, who had openly admitted to killing one girl and harming others, have additional victims? Before relocating to Marple, David had served as a pastor at a now-closed church in Flanders, New Jersey, for several years. During his time at Trinity, he had been an outspoken advocate against the inclusion of education about sexuality in the local school district's curriculum. Less than a year after the discovery of Gretchen's remains, he moved his family to a church in Plano, Texas, just outside Dallas, where he led the congregation for 7 years. Following this, David's pastoral journey took him to the Living Faith Community Church in San Diego. His final pastoral assignment was in Fairfield, California, from which he retired in 2005 at the age of 65. Authorities were aware that this lengthy period of leadership provided him with considerable influence and access to young and vulnerable individuals. This left them with questions about the potential extent of his actions during these years. The Marple community had at long last received some of the answers it sought for decades, but the shocking turn of events did not bring peace to many residents. It had been far more comforting to believe that an outsider, a disturbed criminal, had committed this heinous act, a person who randomly entered the town, abducted a young girl, and then vanished as swiftly as they arrived. However, the perpetrator was not an outsider, but rather a respected member of their own community. It was a religious leader, a man with a wife and young daughters of his own. This further shattered the sense of security within the community. In the aftermath of all this, Gretchen's family issued a statement. In it, they expressed their gratitude to law enforcement officials for their ongoing dedication to the case. They also conveyed their hope that the individual responsible for Gretchen's tragic murder would be held accountable. Following David's arrest, his legal team initially contested an extradition process. However, prosecutors led by Delaware County District Attorney Jack Stolzheimer sought assistance from Governor Josh Shapiro's office to facilitate the return of the confessed perpetrator to Pennsylvania. David is presently under investigation for potential instances of abuse beyond this case. Additionally, investigators took a DNA sample from David, which could prove valuable in a broader context, aiding in the investigation of other missing persons, as well as cases involving assault and murder nationwide. As we conclude this harrowing case, one can't help but reflect on the complexities and twists that unfolded over the years. What challenges lie ahead of Gretchen's family as they seek closure and healing after all these years? And what about David, the perpetrator? What kind of justice do you think he should face for his actions? And how will his arrest impact other potential cases of abuse? If you have any comments or would like to suggest other cases you would like us to cover, please feel free to share your thoughts below. We appreciate your feedback and value your engagement. On the quiet autumn night of October 31st, 1991, in Tyler, Texas, as the fall season settled in, the clock struck 2 a.m. The peaceful neighborhood of 29th Street was deep in slumber, except for a small framed house nestled at the corner, unaware that it was about to become a scene of horror. 8-year-old Chad Choice lay in his bed, lost in dreams, when an intruder silently invaded the house, snatching him away into the darkness of the night. Initially deemed a runaway incident due to lack of evidence, the case transformed into a nightmare for investigators once the crucial 48-hour window passed without any sign of Chad. Who might have had the means to silently infiltrate Chad's home, spiriting him away without a trace? But the pivotal question remains, would Chad ever reunite with his family and return home? The city Tyler, named after the 10th President of the United States, John Tyler, stands as the largest in northeastern Texas. Often referred to as the Rose Capital or Rose City, Tyler earned its reputation due to its extensive history of rose production, cultivation, and processing. Each October, the city welcomes thousands of tourists. However, the October of 1991 took a dark turn as Chad Choice mysteriously vanished without a trace, casting a shadow over the usually vibrant atmosphere. Ernest Chadwick Choice, known affectionately as Chad Choice, came into the world on April 26, 1983 in Texas. He was one of the cherished 4 children in the Choice household, a beautiful soul deeply adored by his family, particularly his mother, Karen Elaine Choice. Chad was an outgoing youngster, surrounded by a large circle of friends with whom he frequently played. Moreover, his strong bond and affectionate relationship with his siblings were apparent, as they often enjoyed quality time together. Chad's energetic and lively nature was further evident in his regular visits to the playground. Chad had an older sister named Angela Choice, who fondly recalls that her little brother had a passion for riding bikes, scaling trees, and indulging in sports. Details about the remaining siblings were not made public. As a student at Mommy G. Griffin Elementary School, Chad's life was in its budding stage. At just 8 years old, he had his entire future ahead of him. However, fate often takes unforeseen turns, and tragically Chad's destiny had already been sealed. The daily routine of the Choice family was shattered on the morning of October 31st, 1991.
It was my birthday that day, and I was getting ready for church, coffee, and reading, as I always did. And I decided not to wake the children.
On the fateful morning, Chad's mother, Karen, rose early and went to the church without waking her children, allowing them to continue sleeping. However, just a few minutes into her church service, Karen received a phone call.
It was my daughter, and she asked me if Chad was with me. And I said, no, I left him at home. And she said, well, we've looked everywhere and we can't find him.
Karen rushed back home and began scouring the neighborhood for Chad. She sought assistance from her neighbors as well. Despite their collective efforts and their thorough search, Chad seemed to have vanished without a trace. It was as though he had disappeared into thin air.
We were just looking up to see if he was just playing a joke on us, and we were walking around the house looking up in the trees to see if he was there. But all in the same time, there was just something that I just had this feeling something was wrong.
Now it was the police's turn to investigate the matter. Karen dialed 711, reaching the Tyler police station, where Sergeant Bill Goking responded and arrived at their house shortly after the call. During his initial inspection, he looked for signs of a break-in, but there were no indication of forced entry. Moreover, there were no signs of struggle inside the house.
The first thing he notices, no pry marks on the door.
Based on the initial investigation, Goking began to consider the possibility that Chad might have run away from home.
We didn't see anything like a forced entry, any blood trails, any signs of ransacking, things that would be indicative of a crime scene.
However, Karen firmly believed that her son had been kidnapped, and as the sun set and the day turned into a chilly night, her tension escalated into fear.
Fear starts to set in, and you're wondering what is going on, who is he with? Because I knew it's dark now, and he's ready to come home.
Adding to her fear, the crucial 48-hour window had passed without any signs of him.
Kind of a rule of thumb, and it's not like this in every case, but if you're not on the road towards resolving something in 48 hours, it's going to be difficult to resolve.
Later during the interview, Chad's older sister Angela Choice provided a crucial piece of information to the detective. Her house keys had disappeared the day before, and she distinctly recalled leaving them by the back door of their residence. This revelation raised additional questions, suggesting the possibility of a planned kidnapping or something even more disturbing. 2 days after Chad's disappearance, a ransom note was discovered at the business of Chad's uncle, Greg Sterling.
By this time, our hopes that Chad was alive were slim. We really didn't have any idea in our own minds that he would still be alive. So another demand would seem very strange.
Prompting the investigation to swiftly shift focus to a kidnapping scenario. As the family attempted to deliver the money at the Greyhound bus station, as instructed, the kidnapper failed to appear.
There was this renewal for a brief moment, and then we sat there and we waited and waited and waited and they didn't come through.
Several days later, Chad's mother received an anonymous phone call revealing that Chad's disappearance was leaked to a family member's drug debt with a man named Paco. Investigators discovered that Greg Sterling owed money to 3 Colombian drug dealers in the area, Paco Jr. and Carlos, shedding light on a possible motive of Chad's abduction. However, the case still remained elusive. On the 1-year anniversary of Chad's disappearance, his mother, Karen Choice, discovered a note fluttering on her car windshield. The note asserted that Chad was still alive and demanded $6,000 for his safe return. This development reignited the investigation, filling the Choice family with hope and prayers of seeing Chad again. However, the case suffered a setback when the kidnapper failed to make contact once more, causing the investigation to stall again. Time was not on their side. Slowly, years were passing by, and Chad Choice's disappearance gradually evolved into a cold case. 4 years later, in October 1995, a grocery sack appeared on the Chase family's doorstep. Initially, it seemed like a regular grocery sack. However, upon opening, it revealed something that would haunt Karen Choice for the rest of her life. Inside the package was a human skull.
There was this part of me that was saying, this may be, but I'm saying no. No, this is not Chad. Chad is still alive.
The skull was subsequently sent to the FBI for analysis. DNA samples from Choice's family were collected to compare with the skull's DNA to confirm its identity as Chad's. Despite these efforts, the results remained inconclusive. Later, the skull was sent to a university in Texas for further examination, involving the expertise of forensic anthropology.
Sometimes, and particularly in the case of children, when there is not much of a medical or dental record, we might resort to other techniques. For example, if we think we know who the remains represent, we might ask for photographs of the individual, and we might attempt to do some sort of comparison between the skeletal remains and a photograph.
The results came back, and unfortunately, Karen's worst fears were confirmed when forensic analysis revealed that the skull indeed belonged to Chad. Investigators grappled with the ruthless nature of a person who not only commits a crime, but continues to torment the victim's family for years. Despite the struggle to comprehend this, Karen, all along, had an unshakable feeling in her heart that she would never see Chad alive again. All she could do now was pray for justice.
It's demonic to do something like this and then to place it on the family's doorstep. Who is this person? And I mean, I think that there was an anger that rose up in me that I had never felt before. I had to see who this person was.
While Chad Choice's case grew increasingly difficult to solve, another narrative unfolded in Smith County Jail in early 1996. A man named Patrick Horn was slated to be sentenced in federal court for credit union robberies and carjacking charges. He was also charged with the murder of J.C. Levasseur, a fruit stand owner.
Same credit union gets robbed. Again, it's the same thing. 2 men come in with their faces covered up, carrying weapons, immediately rush the tellers, catching them off guard, and demand money.
It was our belief that probably the same 2 people were responsible for it. It happened in the same manner. 2 black males walked in, masked.
It became evident that he was destined to spend the rest of his life behind bars or even face a potential death sentence. However, this man we are discussing was soon to become the center of Chad's murder case. It occurred when he mentioned the name Chad Choice to the police during his time behind the bars. While this might have been a part of a deal to reduce his prison sentence, to the investigators, it marked the first significant breakthrough they had made in the case so far. Horn was a resident in the Choice family's neighborhood and was friends with them. During his interview regarding Chad's case, Horn informed investigators that he knew the identity of Chad's killer. As per Horn's account, Chad was murdered by 2 local drug dealers, both Colombian nationals, who were known by the street names Paco and Carlos. But the case was just about to get more twisted. After Horn made the statement, he received a package in his jail cell containing a small boy's leg bone, later confirmed through analysis to be Chad's.
The jailers intercept this package that was sent to Pat Horn. They find what appears to be a leg bone and also a note threatening him that if he gives any information about Chad Choice, that they'll kill him or kill his family.
Horn asserted to the police that Paco and Carlos had sent the package. However, detectives couldn't shake the feeling that Horn was hiding something significant about the entire story. Despite repeated questioning by the detectives, Horn consistently maintained that he had no additional information apart from Paco and Carlos being the culprits. However, on May 31st, 1996, Horn finally disclosed something more.
He told us that he had helped, that he had dug a grave for Chad at the direction of Paco and Carlos.
He tells us, he says, see, you know, basically I'm a victim in this crime as well. All I did was help bury the child, didn't have any other involvement in it, and now they're threatening me because of my knowledge of what they did.
Horn then revealed the precise location where Chad was buried. Shortly afterward, he was escorted by the police to 401 Sunnyside in Tyler, which was Horn's own backyard.
I think one thing that made us doubt Pat Horn was knowing just how much he was involved with these guys, because Pat had a reputation of exaggerating and trying to build up his own self-importance.
He really opens the door wide as far as us looking at him as being involved in this, certainly more so than he tells us.
Some of the agents and officers dug down. They hit a plastic bag and dug a little more and found bones, found clothing.
At 4 p.m. that same day, the detectives began digging and discovered Chad's skeletal remains, along with .38 caliber shell casings. This moment marked a sudden turn in the investigation. With the evidence before them, all suspicions now pointed directly at Patrick Horn. Without delay, in June 1996, the investigators hurried to Athens, a city in Texas. In a jail cell there, a man sat who was anticipated to be a crucial piece of the puzzle, important in solving the case once and for all.
We seized an opportunity when he was in custody in Athens and really conducted a hard interview with him, and he chose to come forward.
This man was none other than Patrick Horn's brother, Keaton Horn, who was facing charges of probation violation. The detective's suspicions were completely on point this time. With Keaton's statement, this case solidified into concrete evidence that Horn was indeed responsible for this notorious crime.
He admitted to digging up the bones, or the leg bone, and mailing to Pat in jail, and at his direction, preparing the note to make it look like a threat from Paco and Carlos.
What Keaton did was show us that Paco and Carlos had not reached out to Pat to threaten him, that Pat had reached out to himself basically to make it look like he was being threatened, which was a very, very important break in the case.
Horn's scheme to mislead investigators had ultimately unraveled. The solution to a seemingly unsolvable case was finally in hand. However, one question still lingered. Why did Horn kill Chad?
Pat's ambition was to be a gangster, to be a crook. And Pat is one of those people that I believe that if he's not recognized by someone else, he's going to make sure that someone recognizes what he did. I mean, it's a sixth sense of what he did.
On September 24, 1999, 8 years after Chad Choice's murder, the jury found Horn guilty in the Smith County Courthouse and sentenced him to death. However, even at the end of his chapter, Horn wouldn't cease tormenting the Choice household. Horn adamantly refused to sign the waiver allowing Chad's remains to be released to his family for a proper burial. Legally, he was required to agree to the release since the remains were evidence in his case. However, he insisted on retaining control over the fate of the 8-year-old Chad's remains. Horn did initially sign a waiver, indicating his agreement to the release of Chad Choice's remains. However, the document was somehow lost between his attorney's office and the judge's office. At first deemed a mere formality, District Judge Diane DiVasato announced in a December 1999 hearing that she would order the release of 30 exhibits, including Chad's skull and other bones, to his family for burial, contingent upon Horn signing another waiver. Horn's appellate lawyer, Tony Wilkinson of Greenville, sent the document to Horn via Federal Express, anticipating its return with his signature within a day. However, a month passed without any response from Horn. He did not reply to several letters from his attorney and ignored messages sent to him through officials at the Atlanta Federal Prison. Assistant District Attorney Ed Marty stated that if the remains were granted without the waiver, they might have to be exhumed sometime in the future. It remains uncertain when Horn eventually signed the waiver, and if he did, when he signed
I
it.
treated you like you were my son. Always welcome in my house. Fed you. Prayed for you. What about Chad? You want to see a picture to remind you? Don't you want to see his picture? I need to know that. What about Chad's life? Nobody gave him that choice.
You know, you talk like you're some sort of badass. Damn it, you put your own ass there when you took her boy. You shouldn't have took her boy. Damn it. Don't nobody. Damn, treat you like family, Pat. Help her out. Get off your ass, Pat, and help her out. Just help her out. Pat. 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 Pat, please. Please, Pat. Pat, I got to know. Pat.
Furthermore, Horn was 17 years old when he committed the murder of Chad. According to a ruling by the United States Supreme Court, anyone under the age of 18 cannot be executed. As a result, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. While this might not have been the exact form of justice Karen Choice desired, she can finally find solace in knowing that Patrick Horn will never walk free. As the final chapter in the Chad Joyce case concludes, there remains a haunting mystery that continues to trouble both investigators and Chad's grieving family. Why did Patrick Horn go to such lengths, kidnapping Chad Joyce, refusing the ransom, and ultimately taking his life? What could have motivated such a horrifying act? And do you believe the mother who lost her beloved child will ever find peace again? Let us know your thoughts. We're eager to hear from you. At 4:45 p.m. on January 24, 1991, in East Harlem, New York, 13-year-old Paola Illera returned home from school. Her mother buzzed her in as she entered her apartment building's elevator and headed for her family's 30th floor unit. However, she mysteriously vanished during that short journey. 3 hours later, around 7:30 p.m., a man out on a walk with his dog discovered Paola's lifeless body half a mile away from her home. As the sun set on that tragic day, the neighborhood was left with haunting questions. What happened to Paola, and who could be behind her disappearance and death? Paola and her family were part of the community of East Harlem, also known as El Barrio, located in the heart of Manhattan, New York City. This culturally rich enclave is renowned for its dynamic mix of traditions, art, and community spirit. East Harlem boasts a diverse population with a strong Hispanic and Latino heritage, evidenced by its lively festivals, eateries, and colorful murals that adorn its streets. The neighborhood is home to the famous Museum of the City of New York, showcasing the city's history. According to statistics, your chance of being a victim of crime in East Harlem is about 1 in 22. And it is here our story began. Paola Illera was born in Colombia in the late 1970s to her parents, Cesar and Olga Illera. She had 2 older siblings, Julio and Alexandra. In June of 1990, Paola, along with her mother and 2 siblings, moved to East Harlem, New York City, in hopes of finding a better life. They lived on the 30th floor of an apartment building at 420 East 111th Street, where they stayed with Paola's uncle, Guillermo Ospina. Her father, Cesar, remained in Colombia, working as a taxi driver, and was saving money to eventually join them in New York. Upon their arrival in New York, Paola started attending junior high school 99. According to her sister, Alexandra, Paola excelled academically, focusing her spare time on studying English and mathematics. She had only a handful of friends, mostly classmates, and aspired to become a lawyer to help those in need. Her uncle Guillermo described her as highly intelligent and mature for her age, thinking beyond her years. He also noted that Paola was very happy in New York because of her love for the English language. She was a young girl with many plans for the future, her uncle Guillermo said. Everything appeared to be going smoothly for Paola and her family until a heartbreaking event suddenly changed their lives. On the cold afternoon of January 24th, 1991, Paola, who was just 13 years old at the time, left her school and made her way back to the familiar surroundings of her apartment building. At approximately 4:45 p.m., she arrived at the entrance of the building and used the intercom to call her apartment. Her mother, Olga, answered and let her in by pressing the button to unlock the lobby door. This ordinary interaction would be the final one Olga would share with her beloved daughter. With the door now open, Paola entered the lobby and stepped into an elevator, but tragically, she never made it to their 30th floor apartment. 10 minutes later, when Paola hadn't arrived home, her brother and uncle grew worried. They felt that something was amiss and decided to go look for her. As they hurried down to the lobby, they found it completely empty. They began searching the neighborhood desperately for Paola, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. 3 hours later, around 7:30 p.m., a man out for a walk with his dog made a chilling discovery. He spotted a lifeless figure lying on a walkway near the East River. The area was littered with drug-related items like vials, syringes, and used lighters. Tragically, what he found was Paola's slender body, and she had passed away. The site where she was found was located about a half a mile to the south of the apartment building where she lived. When detectives arrived at the scene, they were faced with a deeply saddening sight.
There was a stab wound in the center of her chest, and further examination revealed that she had a ligature around her neck. And there was hardly any blood coming from the stab wound.
There were no clues to indicate who might have committed this crime. The only things they discovered on Paola's body were a New Kids on the Block watch on her wrist and a piece of chalk in her pocket. Paola's murder profoundly affected not only her family, but also the entire neighborhood. Her mother, Olga, was inconsolable, struggling to come to terms with the loss of her daughter. At Paola's school, both students and teachers were in shock. In the aftermath of this tragedy, teachers held meetings with students to provide support for those who were close to Paola, helping them cope with their grief. They also advised all students not to walk alone in the area for safety reasons. In response to the incident, reporters were not allowed to access the school, and the principal and district officials declined to speak with them. Detectives were left with numerous unanswered questions. They went from door to door in the 32-floor building, hoping to find witnesses who might have seen Paola in the area where her body was eventually discovered. Unfortunately, they couldn't locate anyone who had seen her there. Moreover, the detectives had no information about the appearance of the person responsible for this tragedy. It remained uncertain whether Paola was killed in the isolated spot filled with crack vials where her body was found or somewhere else. Through their investigation, the detectives managed to piece together some important details. They discovered that Paola regularly stayed at school after hours for a journalism workshop on Wednesdays and Thursdays. On the day of her tragic murder, she had been working on an article about her father, intending to send it to him as a Valentine's Day gift. The detectives also found out that on that fateful day, Paola left the school after the workshop at around 4 p.m. and walked north along First Avenue with a friend. They parted ways at 106th Street, with Paola continuing to her family's apartment building. During their inquiries, the detective learned that another teenager named Aaron Wofford had entered the same elevator as Paola. However, when they spoke with him, he claimed to have gotten off at the 19th floor, while Paola continued upward. As a result, the detectives shifted their focus away from him as a suspect. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the terrible ordeal Paola had endured. She had been violated, strangled, and stabbed 3 times near her heart. The medical examiner also noticed unusual elongated marks on her thighs. It was clear that Paola had bravely resisted an assault, and her attacker had forcefully separated her legs, causing bruises on their thighs that matched the shape of their fingers. The examiner also collected male hair from her body, this was stored as evidence. On February 2, 1991, Paola's body was laid to rest at St. Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens. 4 months later, after her tragic murder, Paola's family decided to relocate to Flushing, New York, and they received support from Victim Services, a private nonprofit organization that assists victims of violent crimes and their families. In Flushing, Olga sought solace through counseling at the Families of Homicide Victims program, also run by Victim Services. As the family continued to cope and heal, they held on to the hope of achieving justice for Paola. However, as this time passed, Paola's case gradually grew colder, and the quest for answers became increasingly challenging. The murder of a 13-year-old girl should have been a major news story in any city at any time. However, in the violence-ridden New York of 1991, this dreadful crime in East Harlem was largely unnoticed. Between 1990 and 1992, the city reported over 2,000 murders each year, with an average of 6 bodies discovered daily across the 5 boroughs of New York City. Unfortunately, most of these occurred in impoverished, predominantly minority neighborhoods, such as East Harlem, the South Bronx, and East New York, Brooklyn. Regrettably, very few of these cases received significant attention from the media. Instead, the media often focused on more upscale crimes involving white, wealthy victims in picturesque locations. Without the pressure from the media or politicians, Paola's case became a low-priority homicide. Consequently, her murder remained unsolved and largely forgotten throughout much of the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, crime rates in New York City were on the decline. However, in the housing projects of East Harlem, a disturbing trend persisted. A series of seemingly unrelated incidents began to occur, all involving the assault and murder of young, attractive teenagers with large skin, regardless of whether they were Black or Hispanic. In 1994, a 15-year-old girl became a victim when she was confronted by an attacker brandishing a knife. This case revealed a consistent pattern used by the assailant, which he would repeat multiple times over the next 4 years. He would approach the teenager from behind and guide her to an isolated location. There he would blindfold her using a piece of her own clothing, coerce her to undress, and then subject her to assault. Remarkably, the 15-year-old survivor was able to provide a description of her attacker. He was a well-groomed young man with a muscular build, and he displayed an excessive sense of self-importance. Shockingly, he even told the victim that she should consider herself fortunate to be assaulted by someone as good-looking as himself. A few years later, on September 10, 1997, firefighters responded to a rooftop fire at the George Washington houses on East 104th Street.
A response from a Bronx precinct who had a missing person report of a young woman by the name of Johannes Castro.
In the aftermath, they discovered the lifeless body of a woman who had suffered severe abuse, had been struck with a blunt object, and was burnt so badly that she was unrecognizable. This victim was later identified as 19-year-old Johannes Castro, who had moved to New York from the Dominican Republic with her family. Johannes, a young mother with a daughter, had been pursuing her studies in computer science at a community college in the Bronx. 7 months later, in April 1998, a 13-year-old girl was the next victim in the same neighborhood. Thankfully, this young victim managed to escape with her life. 2 months after that, on June 2, 1998, 17-year-old Rashida Washington met a tragic end. She was found in a 15th-floor stairwell of an East 112th Street housing project, having been robbed, assaulted, and strangled.
At the time we found her, we weren't sure exactly what had happened to her. We got the job as an investigative DOA.
She was nude underneath this shirt that was covering her almost like a shroud. It was like it was placed over her face and upper body, but she was nude underneath, no bra, no shirt.
Her lifeless body, with its naked torso covered by a shirt, had been positioned in a seated stance against the wall. Similar to the earlier victims, Rashida, a fashion student who worked at a clothing boutique, was petite, weighing only 100 pounds. Tragically, she was murdered just 3 days after celebrating her 18th birthday. In that same year, during the fall, 2 more young teenagers fell victim to assaults in the same area. A 15-year-old was attacked on September 25, 1998, followed by a 14-year-old on November 16. Thankfully, these 2 adolescents survived, likely because they didn't get a good look at the attacker before being blindfolded.
Interviewed her boyfriend. We interviewed a lot of people, but there was nobody that was really sticking out as a viable suspect.
Even as these similar cases continued to accumulate, the police did not publicly acknowledge the possibility of a serial murderer targeting teenage girls in East Harlem. However, due to the concerns raised by the parents of the victims, the police eventually decided to take prompt action. In the 1990s, there was a relatively small database of DNA samples on record because of widespread testing of convicted felons had not yet begun. However, a significant breakthrough had occurred in the autumn of 1998 concerning the East Harlem cases. New York police experts in forensics compared bodily fluid evidence from the Rashida Washington murder with evidence from 2 other similar cases in the neighborhood. These tests conclusively linked the same perpetrator to all 3 crimes.
From rape victim 1 was originally believed to be part of a different pattern. And as it turned out, that case was not part of that rape pattern, but had created a new pattern with homicide victim Rashida Washington and this rape case.
Finally, detectives had solid evidence confirming the existence of a serial criminal preying on teenagers in Harlem. In response, police leadership assembled a specialized task force comprising detectives with the sole mission of apprehending the suspect. The police took action by distributing a wanted poster that included a sketch of the serial attacker. This sketch was based on descriptions provided by the victims. Shortly after posting the flyer in East Harlem, a tipster who called in suggested that the detectives should closely investigate a 25-year-old man known as Ace, who resided on the 19th floor of the same building where Paola had lived. The police quickly identified Ace's real name as Aran Key, and this name triggered a memory. The name Aran had initially surfaced during Paola's murder investigation. Detectives recalled the teenager named Aran Wofford, who had been seen entering the elevator at the same time as Paola and had claimed to have exited on the 19th floor. The distinctive first name, Aran, had also reappeared in the investigation of Johias Castro's murder in 1997.
They pull phone records and find a series of calls from Johallis's home in the Bronx to a Cynthia Key in Manhattan's East Harlem neighborhood.
I spoke to Miss Key on the phone. I called up, identified myself. I asked her if, she knew this, this person. She said no. She says, but I have a son who, is about that age. Maybe he might know her. So I asked her what her son's name was, and she told me his name was Aaron Malik Key. And she said he wasn't home at the time. So I left her my name and number, and I said, do me a favor, when he comes in, have him call me.
Phone records showed that in the days leading up to her death, Johias had made numerous calls to a man named Aran Key. When questioned by the police, Aran explained that Johias had been a friend of his girlfriend, Jacqueline. He accounted for his numerous phone calls by stating that the 2 women had been planning a shopping trip on the day of Johias' murder. The police also interviewed Jacqueline, who confirmed Aran's explanation. It was only later that the police realized that Aran Wofford and Aran Key were actually the same person. Wofford was his father's last name, and Key was his mother's. This revelation connected Aran Key to 2 out of the 3 victims in the suspected serial killer case. He was the last person known to have seen Paola alive, and there was a significant history of phone communication between him and Johias in the days leading up to her death. These connections could not only have been coincidence. Detectives decided to dig deeper into Aran's background. They found that he was an intelligent and reasonably well-spoken individual He was born on September 18, 1973, and he had spent most of his childhood in East Harlem. During the time of Paola's disappearance in 1991, he was living with relatives in the same building as her. Aran was known as a charming person with a knack for computers. He claimed to be involved in rap music production, although there was little evidence to support this claim. Physically, he stood just 5 feet 8 inches, and he was fairly handsome. His criminal record showed only one arrest for robbery in 1990, and he had spent little or no time behind bars. However, neighbors had a different perspective on Aran. They described him as having a troubling side. He had a habit of peering through the peepholes of women in his building, and he often wandered around with a portable video camera, attempting to capture inappropriate footage. At this stage, the police didn't have much substantial evidence against Aran, but they understood the importance of a thorough investigation. They focused on the assailant involved in the September 1998 incident, who had left behind a black FUBU cap and a gray sweatshirt. The detectives decided to look closer into these clothing items for leads. Their efforts paid off when they found a laundry tag on one of the garments. This tag eventually led the police to a dry cleaner located near Aran's building. What made this discovery even more significant was that the client list at this dry cleaner included Aran's mother, Cynthia. Every piece of information seemed to point to Aran as a prime suspect, and law enforcement was increasingly convinced that testing his DNA would confirm his involvement in the crimes. However, there was a significant hurdle. Aran had no DNA on record because mandatory DNA testing for accused felons in New York wouldn't begin until the year 2000. In the 1990s, obtaining a DNA sample was not as straightforward as bringing a suspect and asking for a swab. DNA tests were still seen as invasive procedures, and acquiring a sample required judicial authorization based on reasonable suspicion. Even though there was substantial circumstantial evidence pointing towards Aran's involvement, detectives were aware that the details like the elevator ride, phone calls, and the laundry tag alone wouldn't be enough to persuade a judge to order Aran to provide a DNA sample. Consequently, the police had to resort to an alternative plan. Their initial approach involved tailing Aran Key, hoping he would unknowingly leave behind a sample of his saliva, like through spitting or disposing of chewing gum. However, this tactic quickly proved to be unsuccessful. On February 8, 1999, detectives finally caught a break when Aran was arrested for his involvement in the theft of a computer hard drive. Since there were no laws mandating DNA testing for arrested individuals in New York at that time, the police had to resort to a bit of trickery in an attempt to obtain a DNA sample. They devised a plan where a female detective disguised herself as a doctor. Wearing a white hospital garment, she approached Aran and asked him to provide a saliva sample for what she described as a routine tuberculosis test. She handed him paperwork and hoped he would sign a release form. However, Aran, being cautious, took the time to read the document. When he noticed a line mentioning DNA analysis, he refused to cooperate. He claimed that he was a practicing Jehovah's Witness and that his faith prohibited him from participating in any form of medical treatment. Aran had figured out what the police were after, and he was determined not to give it to them. After finishing his meal that evening, he tore his paper cup into pieces and flushed them down the toilet. To further confuse investigators, he swapped his cup with that of his cellmate. However, the police were one step ahead. Shortly after Aran's arrest, he had been in a shared holding cell with several other men. During their time there, attendants had provided them with cups of water. Detectives managed to locate these cups in a waste paper basket and sent them for DNA testing. Within just a couple of days, the results came back, confirming that a sample collected from the rim of one of the cups found in the police holding cell matched the DNA of the East Harlem criminal. By the time the DNA test results were ready on February 12, 1999, Aran had already been released without bail, as he was only facing a misdemeanor charge related to computer theft. Meanwhile, the New York Police Department offered an $11,000 reward for any information that could lead to his arrest. Authorities soon discovered that Aran had traveled to Brownsville, Brooklyn, and met up with his 16-year-old girlfriend named Angelique Stalling. Her parents believed that they were going on a Valentine's Day date. However, instead of sticking to their plans, Aran and Angelique boarded a bus headed for Florida from Newark, New Jersey. Detectives grew concerned that Angelique might be in danger, potentially facing the same fate as the previous victims. After Aran arrived in South Florida, he made 2 phone calls to another girlfriend back in New York. By this time, news of his status as a suspected serial killer on the run had made headlines. The second girlfriend, aware of the situation, promptly contacted the police and provided a tip that Aran was staying at the Miami Sun Hotel, located just 2 blocks from the beach on Northeast 1st Avenue in downtown Miami. Responding to this tip, 2 New York detectives rushed to the hotel and began surveilling it. When they spotted Aran and Angelique walking around inside, they called a Miami-Dade SWAT team for assistance. The SWAT team stormed the building and discovered Aran and Angelique hiding under the bed on the hotel's 6th floor. And on February 19, 1999, Aran was apprehended and placed in custody. When detectives attempted to interrogate Aran about the East Harlem crimes, he remained silent and didn't provide any information. However, the police had a plan. They later observed and listened from behind a 2-way mirror as they allowed Angelique into the interview room. Aran and Angelique believed they were having a private moment to say their goodbyes. During this conversation, Angelique pressed Aran to explain why he had committed the crimes. Aran's response was cryptic. He mentioned that he had bugged out and claimed to have had a sickness. After a lengthy 4-month legal battle, Aran was eventually extradited to New York to face trial on 22 felony charges related to 4 assaults and the murders of Paola Illera, Johias Castro, and Rashida Washington. DNA evidence connected Aran to 6 out of the 7 cases. During the trial, in the fall of 2000, prosecutors John Irwin and Richard Plansky presented a powerful case. With a barrage of testimonies and DNA evidence against Aran, they called upon 130 prosecution witnesses, including 2 of Aran's victims. Aran himself insisted on being the first defense witness to take the stand. Over the course of 2 days of testimony, Aran displayed a range of emotions, from giggling like a schoolgirl to crying like a baby. He also expressed his anger at being prosecuted. His monologue, which was largely uninterrupted by the judge, prosecutors, or his own attorneys, covered a wide range of topics, including pop culture, drugs, rap music, jail food, and his reflections on the criminal justice system. With many of his victims' family members present in the courtroom, Aran wove a bizarre narrative to explain why he found himself facing charges of brutal serial violence against young women. He asserted that the police had conspired to frame him as a part of a cover-up orchestrated by a corrupt medical examiner who was involved in harvesting and selling human organs. He even claimed that his DNA had been manipulated in what he referred to as genetic shuffling. However, the jury did not buy into his elaborate story. On December 16, 2000, when the guilty verdict was delivered, the courtroom burst into cheers. As Aran was later led past the crowd of grieving relatives, he directed a profane curse at them. During the sentencing a month later, in January 2001, family members of Aran's victims had the opportunity to speak directly to him. Olga, Paola's mother, addressed him, expressing her wish that he would understand the torment of sleepless nights, loss of appetite, the inability to walk or breathe, and the absence of peace, all the while thinking about her daughter's suffering at the time of her death. Olga spoke of her enduring pain, having brought her daughter to the country in pursuit of the American dream. When it was Aran's turn to speak at the sentencing hearing, he began to cry and said that he was sorry. In response to this, a male cousin of Johias Castro erupted in anger and attempted to leap over the barrier in an effort to attack Aran. Following this, Justice Joan Sodolnik delivered the sentence. She imposed 3 life sentences on Aran, each without the possibility of parole, for the 3 murders. Additionally, he received a 400-year sentence for 4 counts of abuse. Aran was incarcerated in the Clinton Correctional Facility, located in Dannemora, New York. By the time Aran was sentenced, lawmakers in New York and many other states had enacted laws requiring DNA testing for individuals arrested in connection with violent crimes. Since then, this testing has been expanded to encompass most felony arrests, spanning both violent and nonviolent offenses. Moreover, certain jurisdictions have initiated DNA testing for individuals arrested for misdemeanors. For Olga, the agony of losing Paola remains as raw as ever. She understands all too clearly that the anguish stemming from the sudden and senseless loss of a loved one doesn't fade with time, especially when so many unresolved questions linger. As we conclude this heart-wrenching journey through Paola's tragic story, her memory and that of the other victims lingers in our thoughts. Reflecting on Aran's actions and consequences he faced, we are left with thought-provoking questions. What drives an individual like Aran to commit crimes like this? And how can society identify and address the factors that lead to such behavior? On August 9, 1980, high school sweethearts Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, both 19, disappeared after attending a wedding reception at Concord House, Concord, Wisconsin. Within the next few days, searchers found some clues about the couple's whereabouts scattered across town in Concord. A pair of pants, Tim's car with his wallet inside, some ropes, and a pair of women's underwear. These clues led to a grisly discovery. 2 months later, the bodies of Tim and Kelly were found savagely violated and left to rot in a field. Almost 3 decades later, advancements in DNA technology, coupled with an unlikely witness and an investigator's relentless search for truth, led to the identification of the perpetrator. A man so unassuming, even his neighbors had no idea he harbored such dark secrets. But who was this man, and why did it take so long to find him? Today's story takes us back to Concord, Wisconsin, a small town in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. With a population just over 2,000, the quiet town has many parks and nature spots, making it an excellent place for people who love the outdoors. So activities like hiking, biking, fishing, and camping are common among the locals. Concord has a violent crime rate about 7%, about a third of the U.S. average of 22.7%. In the 1980s, when the main events in today's story occur, Concord was the sort of place where people never locked their doors and neighbors looked out for each other. So, it was just the sort of place where 19-year-old high school sweethearts, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, believed they could get married, settle on a farm, raise their children, and grow old together. In 1980, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew were 19-year-old high school sweethearts, engaged to be married. Although Tim lived with his family in Hebron, a small town in Jefferson County, and Kelly lived with her family in Fort Atkinson, also in Jefferson County, the couple first met when attending Fort Atkinson High School. Kelly was a beautiful, kind young woman with a passion for cosmetology. Tim was a strong and hardworking farm boy. They were both loved by their friends and family for their kind-hearted natures, but as a couple, Tim and Kelly were seen as people for other youngsters to aspire to be like. After high school, Tim started his career as a farmer, and his best friend was a tractor nicknamed the Lonesome Loser. Meanwhile, Kelly went to beauty school and had just graduated in 1980, hoping to become a hairstylist and beautician. On August 9, 1980, Tim and Kelly attended a wedding reception at Concord House, Wisconsin. The couple had plans to meet some friends and go to a carnival after the reception, but they never showed up. The last time anyone saw them alive was around 11 p.m. on August 9, 1980, when they left the reception. By the morning of the following day, August 10, 1980, when they still hadn't been seen or heard from, Tim's father, David Hack, filed missing person reports for both of them. That same day, David found Tim's brown Oldsmobile in the Concord House's parking lot. Locked inside the car was Tim's wallet containing $67, his jacket, and his checkbook.
They were boyfriend and girlfriend. There was some talk, I remember. Did they elope? Did they take a bus someplace?
On August 15th, searchers found Kelly's pants and underwear by the roadside, about 3 miles from Concord House, with male bodily fluids on them. They also found some ropes by the roadside that had been knotted by someone who appeared to have military experience.
Over the course of 10 days, multiple pieces of clothing belonging to Kelly are found along the roadway within a 6-mile radius of the Concord House. as well as about a dozen pieces of rope with various knots tied in it.
We have very good evidence now.
The discovery of these articles of clothing shifted the case drastically. Suddenly, it was no longer a matter of finding a couple who might have just decided to take off and have a romantic getaway. It was now a matter of trying to find them alive because they were likely in danger. About 2 months later, some squirrel hunters from Milwaukee were out in the Isonia, Wisconsin area, about 7 miles from the Concord House. While walking through a wooded area along a railroad track parallel to Highway 16 east of Watertown, they found the badly decomposed remains of Kelly Drew. She was completely naked. About 100 yards away, they found a fully clothed male body that was identified as the body of Tim Hack. The case, now officially a homicide, was dubbed the Sweetheart Murders.
The manner of death for both of them was homicide.
I had the radio on, and they announced over the radio that they had indeed found both bodies. And so I'm going to tear up. So I remember walking in the kitchen, and the detective is there with my parents, telling them that they did indeed find Tim and Kelly.
The cause of death was not immediately apparent because investigators found no murder weapon at the scene. However, upon examination, the medical examiner found stab wounds on Tim's body and ligature marks on Kelly, suggesting death by stabbing and strangulation.
There were ligature marks on Kelly's ankles and wrists that were consistent with having been bound. Kelly was most possibly strangled based on damage and insect activity around the throat area.
The bodily fluids found on Kelly's clothes also suggested assault. The Sweetheart Murders had all the elements of a sensational story, so it started making headlines across the country. 2 teenage sweethearts appeared to have been murdered in a senseless act of violence, and police could not identify the killer or killers. Their investigation began while interviewing everyone who knew the couple to find out if anyone might have hated them enough to kill them. Police also interviewed everyone who attended the wedding reception, including the Concord House staff who worked there that night. One of the questioned workers was Edward Wayne Edwards, a handyman working at the Concord House. Edward, who lived in a campground adjacent to the Concord House near Interstate 94, claimed that he had not seen the couple and that he was not even at the Concord House around the time the couple went missing. He claimed that he was deer hunting in the nearby woods. However, police noticed that he had a broken nose. When they asked him about it, he claimed he had gotten it during his deer hunting trip. It seemed weird to the investigators because this was August, and deer hunting season in Wisconsin was around November. After the police questioned him, Edward moved his wife and his 5 children away from Wisconsin in September 1980. Meanwhile, the most promising lead investigators had were eyewitness accounts of a dirty-looking van that had been parked next to Tim's car in the Concord House parking lot. Witnesses claimed that they noticed the van suddenly driving away suspiciously around the time Tim and Kelly were last seen. Edward had a van that fit that description, where he often kept a .357 revolver. But without a plate number or strong evidence connecting him to the crime scene, police could do very little to follow up on that lead. And like that, all other leads in the investigation dried up. The case file was shelved and the case went cold. In 2028, 20 years after the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, Richard Lewell from the Wisconsin Department of Justice, one of the investigators in charge of the original investigation, asked for the case to be reopened. For almost 30 years, Lewell had been unable to let go of the case. For almost 30 years, Lewell had been unable to let go of the case. And now that he was close to retirement, he wanted to do everything in his power to close the case. In an interview, he said, "As I was reaching my retirement age, DNA was making drastic leaps and bounds. He felt more confident pursuing the case now because of technological and scientific advancements of the last couple of decades. His newfound confidence was reflected in how he approached the case with vigor." Lewell had a hunch that the police had already interviewed the killer in the earlier stages of the investigation and that the person's name would be on file. He just had to find it. After 2 months of digging through the files, witness statements, and interview recordings, one name stood out to Lewell: Edward Wayne Edwards. Not only did Edward have the opportunity and means to commit the crimes, but the fact that he moved his entire family out of Wisconsin shortly after police interviewed him raised red flags. Lewell and a team of cold case investigators decided to follow up on his hunch that Edward was the potential killer. When they interviewed Edward's neighbors from when he lived in Concord, Wisconsin, they learned that Edward had been a very difficult person to live with. he was short-tempered and volatile, a restless man who often beat his wife and children on a whim. They said he was basically a monster. His son, John Edwards, who was now 37 years old in 2008, described him as a troubled man, saying, "I don't think he knew how to control his emotions. There was some type of rage there." In 2009, April Balacio, Edwards' daughter, contacted authorities with disturbing information. She said she knew some things about the cold case murder of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew that she believed could help investigators close the case. However, this information that she had implicated one of the men closest to her life, her father, Edward Wayne Edwards, a former Marine with a long history of crime. April was a curious child growing up, and her father's unusual life was the most fascinating puzzle to her. Throughout her life, she had questions about how her father lived and why the family had to move around so often. One day, when she was now an adult, she came across the news article about the unsolved murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, and she remembered that they had moved from Concord, Wisconsin around that time. The puzzle was finally falling into place, and she just knew she had to contact authorities. Edward Wayne Edwards was born in Akron, Ohio in 1933. He lost his parents at a young age and had to live in an orphanage run by nuns. Edwards' time at the orphanage was marked with physical and emotional abuse, ultimately shaping him into a restless and rebellious teenager. He had several run-ins with the police for petty crimes like shoplifting and breaking and entering, and by 17, he was serving time at a juvenile detention center. By 1951, when Edward was 18, he was released from juvenile detention on the condition that he joined the U.S. Marines. But after just a few months as a Marine, Edward disappeared and had to be dishonorably discharged. He wasn't ready to leave the life of crime behind, because Edward soon found himself in jail again for robbery. By 1955, when he was 22, he escaped from jail in Akron and traveled across different states robbing gas stations. Edward would spend the rest of his 20s and 30s as a fugitive, drifting around the country while doing odd jobs here and there, working as a ship docker, vacuum cleaner retailer, and handyman. From his autobiography, it is easy to tell that Edward enjoyed his notoriety during this period. According to him, he never tried to use an alias or disguise his identity while committing his crimes because he wanted to be famous. In 1960, at 27, Edward was once again in prison, this time for attempting to impersonate a federal officer. However, he escaped from the Portland, Oregon jail, where he was being held, prompting the FBI to place him on its 10 most wanted list in 1961. In 1962, authorities caught up with Edward and imprisoned him in the United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, but he was paroled in 1967 for good behavior. In his memoir, he attributed his growth to the influence of a benevolent guard at Leavenworth. After his parole, Edward got married and became a motivational speaker. In 1972, at age 39, Edward appeared on 2 television shows, To Tell the Truth and What's My Line. That same year, he released his autobiography, The Metamorphosis of a Criminal, the true life story of Ed Edwards.
He appears on numerous talk shows and game shows with this book about his life as a master criminal. In the late 60s, Edwards was on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list. He was a suspect in a double homicide in Portland, Oregon. They couldn't prove that he did it, but upon checking the criminal history of Edward Wayne Edwards, I see that he has been in prison. He has been convicted of numerous crimes to include robbery, vehicle theft, fraud, arson. He's done a lot of things.
He exhibited all of the classic signs of, the stereotypical signs of a serial killer. He was a bedwetter. He had an affinity for starting fires. He was extremely controlling.
It seemed like the stars were finally lining up for Edward. He had beaten the system. He was on his way to success. Unfortunately, Edward's good luck did not last long. In 1977, he committed his first murder. His victims were 21-year-old Billy Lavaco and his girlfriend, 18-year-old Judith Straub, residents of Sterling, Ohio. Billy and Judith went on a date on August 7, 1977, but never returned. Later that day, Judith's car was found in the parking lot of Silver Creek Metro Park, with her shoes and purse still inside. The following day, August 8th, Norton police, assisted by family members and a National Guard helicopter, launched a search for Billy and Judith. The search party found their bodies in the high weeds near the Metro Park. They had been shot point blank with a 20-gauge shotgun. At the time, investigators could not connect Billy and Judith's case to Edward, so he got away with the murders. These murders also established a pattern that would continue with the murders of Tim and Kelly. Meanwhile, by 1982, when he was 49, Edward was back behind bars in Pennsylvania for arson, but he was still proud of his criminal accomplishments because in 1993, he wrote a letter to the FBI requesting his criminal and history records for cities in 19 states. The records were supposedly for a new book he was writing about criminals he met while in prison, such as Tony Provenzano, Charles Manson, and Jimmy Hoffa. In 1996, Edward, 63 years old, committed his third murder. His victim was his foster son, 25-year-old Danny Boy Edwards, who lived with him in Burton, Ohio, for 7 years. Before he met his grisly end, Danny Boy was a soldier in the U.S. Army. Edward somehow convinced him to abscond from the Army and return home. When he got home, Edward tricked him into entering the nearby woods and then killed him with 2 gunshots to the face. Edward left Danny Boy's body in a shallow grave. A hunter eventually found it there and alerted the authorities. But like his first set of murders, Edward also got away with murdering Danny Boy for the next couple of years. People close to Edward, like his son John and his daughter April, described him as a troubled man. He was extremely abusive to his wife and children, resulting in his children moving away from home as soon as possible to escape his abuse. Investigators believed Edward fit the bill for the stereotypical serial killer. He had a long history of crime, he was physically violent with his family members, and the fact that he wrote a book about his crimes showed that he was a narcissist. Edward also had military experience, so he would have known how to tie the knots on the ropes investigators believed were used to strangle Kelly. In addition, Edward's history of arson fits perfectly with the image of someone extremely controlling. By the time he was in his mid-70s, he was overweight and had to move around in a wheelchair, depending on an oxygen tank to breathe. So, his neighbors in Louisville, Kentucky, had no idea that behind his elderly facade lay an evil mind that had done so much damage. However, with new evidence in April's statements, investigators now had a more solid reason to believe Edward might have been involved in the murders. They had to visit him. When investigators got to his home in Louisville and initially began questioning him, Edward denied knowing anything about the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. He claimed he hadn't heard anything about them going missing, although he had been questioned about it in 1980. But while investigators doubled down and pressed him more, Edward confessed that he had drank some beers at the Concord House on that fateful night and that he may have seen the couple while he was drinking. He also said, contrary to his earlier statement, he had not been deer hunting that night. After the interview, investigators asked if they could take a swab of his saliva for DNA testing. Edward confidently said they could, believing the DNA test would not reveal anything he did not want investigators to know about. When the state crime lab tested Edward's DNA sample, it matched the DNA found on Kelly's pants. In 2009, Edwards had settled in a trailer park in Louisville, Kentucky. He was pleasant and friendly to his neighbors, and none of them suspected that he had such a dark history. That is until police picked him up and brought him to Wisconsin on July 31, 2009. He was charged with the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. While he was being interviewed, Edward was confronted with the results of the DNA test. Investigators asked him to explain how his bodily fluids came to be on Kelly's clothes. Edward started stuttering, cooking up a story about how he and Kelly had gotten intimate earlier that evening of August 9, 1980. But the act was consensual. He was shifting in his seat, moving his hands every which way. When he sensed the investigators were not buying his performance, he sighed and muttered something under his breath. After replaying the interview recording hundreds of times,
I can remember exactly where I was when I heard that recording.
He thought it was under his breath, or maybe it was subconsciously that he said it.
Investigators were confident they had heard what Edward said. Damn it, I killed her. It was as good a confession as any. The gig was up for Edward, and he decided to plead guilty to the murder of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. In April 2010, Edward Wayne Edwards was convicted of the 1980 Sweetheart murders and given 2 life sentences to run concurrently. Although Edward had asked to be executed, Wisconsin had no death penalty. But according to retired homicide detective Phil Waters, Edward had been in and out of prison. He knows what life is like. He's not a guy that wants to be sitting in a prison ward somewhere and dying a slow death. So hoping to convince the state to give him the death penalty, Edward wrote a letter to the Ohio prosecutor's office. saying you're going to want to put a needle in my arm. In 2010, Edward confessed to the murders of 21-year-old Billy Lavaco and 18-year-old Judith Straub, but it turned out that when he committed the murders in 1977, the death penalty was unconstitutional, so he did not get his wish. Instead, he was given a life sentence for each murder, but he still had one trick up his sleeve. In 2011, during a jailhouse interview, Edward confessed to killing his foster son, 25-year-old Danny Boy Edwards. His motive was the $250,000 life insurance policy he was set to receive upon Danny Boy's death. This time, his plan worked. On March 8, 2011, Edward was sentenced to death for the murder of Danny Boy Edwards. Although he was only convicted of 5 murders, police speculate that he could have at least 9 to 15 more undiscovered victims. In the book titled Peyton Allen Files, the author, Phil Stanford, suggested that Edward might have been responsible for the murders of Beverly Allen and Larry Peyton, which took place in Portland, Oregon in 1960. In March 2017, Detective Chad Garcia from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, one of the investigators in charge of the Sweetheart murders, suggested that Edward might have been responsible for 15 other murders, including the famous Zodiac killings. Retired homicide detective John Cameron also believed Edward was responsible for the Zodiac killings and other high-profile unsolved cases, but these claims have not been proven as of yet, so they are considered conspiracy theories. On April 7, 2011, Edward Edwards passed away at the Corrections Medical Center, Columbus, Ohio, at age 77. His death was of natural causes, a relatively merciful ending to a vicious crime spree that left 5 dead and dozens racked with grief. Edward escaped execution by lethal injection, which had been set for August 31, 2011. Although Edward was eventually arrested, and he ultimately did not get away with the murders of Tim and Kelly, their family members have not exactly found relief in that. Kelly's mother, Norma Walker, said instead of getting closure, Edward's arrest ripped open old wounds. She said, "You hoped this day would come, but now that it's here, it's really hard. Everything starts all over again. All the memories come back. He robbed me of my daughter, robbed me of my Christmases, birthdays, weddings, everything families do together." As for Tim's family, the fact that their son and his girlfriend's killer had been found was enough. Tim's father, David, said he was just glad it's over and was grateful for the DNA technology that confirmed Edward was the killer. April Balacio, Edward's daughter whose tip helped close the cold case, now spends her time trying to help the families of victims with unsolved cases find closure. Through her podcast, The Clearing, she investigates cold murder cases and tries to get authorities to reopen them. Tim Hack and Kelly Drew had a bright future ahead of them that was violently snatched away by their killer, Edward Edwards. Edward, the serial killer, had nothing personal against the couple. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, which makes it all the more tragic. Although Edward ultimately got arrested and sentenced to death for his crimes, some believe he escaped justice by dying of natural causes, just weeks before he was scheduled to be executed. What do you think about that? Did Edward get what he deserved? Did his victims get justice? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more.